gives me very great pleasure, and it's a huge privilege to our synagogue to welcome you, Professor Sands, to the pulpit this morning. As I'm sure all of you know, Professor Philippe Sands is an author and renowned expert in international law. He's a professor of public understanding of law at UCL, where he is also director of the Center of International Courts and Tribunals. He was called to the bar in 1985 and appointed King's Counsel in 2003. He's a barrister and a respected expert in public law, arbitration, international law, and environmental and natural resources. From 2011 to 2013, he was a member of the Independent Commission on a Bill of Rights, which was established by the UK government. He has been visiting professor at Harvard Law School since 2019. Philippe has authored numerous acclaimed books, including East-West Street, which Rabbi Igor alluded to, which was awarded the 2016 Bailey Gifford Prize, the 2017 British Book Awards Non-Fiction Book of the Year, and 2018 Prix Montaigne. He's the author of The Rat Line, 2020. His latest book is The Last Colony, a tale of exile, justice, and Britain's colonial legacy, which was published in September 2022. He's also a regular contributor and commentator on international law and justice in publications including The Guardian, Financial Times, and New York Times, and appears regularly on the BBC and CNN. Professor Sands, I welcome you in our traditional way, in the words of the psalmist, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, birachnuchem mibeit Adonai. Blessed are you who come in the name of the Eternal One. We bless you from the house of the Eternal One.
Thank you so much, Rabbis, for this invitation, and thank you to the congregation for the invitation and for the welcome that you've shown to me this morning. I feel very welcome here indeed. It's obviously not the first time I've been here, and I'm very happy to be back. I have a life in this world known as international law, which is the system of rules that governs relations between states and all other actors in the international community. I'm not starry-eyed about international law. I don't for a single moment expect that it will magically bring peace and justice and truth and all the things that we have all together been praying for. But it is just about the best thing that we've got. 4 years ago, I appeared before the International Court of Justice in a case brought by a small African country, the Gambia, against Myanmar in relation to crimes allegedly being perpetrated against a community in Myanmar, the Rohingya, a Muslim community. And this was the first time that a faraway country had exercised a right under international law, under a convention on the prevention and punishment of genocide, to stop those actions. And I was privileged to be one of the counsel for the Gambia. And in the course of the hearings, I found myself seated literally alongside Aung San Suu Kyi, who was leading as the agent of Myanmar. And I have to say, there was not much that I felt positive about in terms of what she said to the court that morning in December 2019, seeking to justify behavior that I thought was not justifiable, and to tell the court that it should play no role in relation to these matters. But she's a very fine speaker, and I think an interesting and very intelligent person who has herself suffered. And she did say one thing that has never left me in the period since, and that was international law, members of the court, is the only language we all have in common. And until she said that, it hadn't really occurred to me that international law provides a set of rules and principles, which of course, like the Torah, are open to interpretation. And reasonable people can disagree about how a text is to be interpreted. But the rules and principles of international law provide a basis in a very difficult world, and it is a very difficult world right now, which connects us all. It is a common language. It is not a perfect common language, but it's a lot better than the alternative. Imagine a world with no international law. Shortly before that hearing, before the International Court of Justice, I was in Washington, at George Washington University, at a seminar on some of the kinds of issues that I work on. And I shared a panel with a very dear friend, who sadly is no longer with us, and a very remarkable human being. His name is Tom Bergenthal, and he was, for several years, the American judge at the International Court of Justice in The Hague. He's written a book that I commend to you, which is extraordinary, called A Lucky Child. It's his memoir. When Tom was 9 years old, he was in a place called Auschwitz, and he was under the protection of a man called Joseph Mengele. Remarkably, he survived, ended up making his way to America, going to Harvard Law School, and having an extraordinarily distinguished career. He's one of the most wonderful human beings I've ever met. And in the course of that seminar, he said to me, Philippe, you're off in a couple of weeks to The Hague to argue the case for the Gambia on what's happening in Myanmar. Can you imagine if, in 1943, when I was at Auschwitz, there had been a treaty called the Genocide Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, or other international instruments, and there had been an international court to which a faraway country could go, and there had been a faraway country that had gone to that court and said, you know what, Germany, what you're doing is not permissible under international law. He said, it probably wouldn't have changed very much in terms of my daily life, but it would have given me strength to know that such a thing was happening. And I do remember the day when the court gave its very far-reaching provisional measures order in the case of the Gambia and Myanmar. And from a place called Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, hundreds and hundreds of refugees from Myanmar stood with plaques which said, thank you, Gambia. And to give Myanmar credit, many of the excesses stopped in relation to that community after the provisional measures order. It had an impact on the well-being of a whole raft of human beings. That horrible story continues, and as we've been just discussing this morning in relation to the prayers, which I have to say I found very touching and wonderfully balanced, we are aware that we are living, as was said right at the introduction by Rabbi Igor, in a time shrouded in darkness. I wake up in the morning and these days go to my email and see what's come in overnight in relation to matters in which I'm involved as a barrister. Ukraine and Russia, Palestine and Israel, Mauritius and the United Kingdom in relation to the Chagos Archipelago, Guyana and Venezuela in relation to a possible imminent invasion of that small South American country's territory. I have never experienced a period in my life, you've got sort of one case that's going on where your client or someone you're acting for, a case you're involved in, concerns an invasion, but something is plainly happening, along with the rise of populism and nationalism, and we are aware, painfully, acutely aware. And so each of my days is completely filled with different instances in which I, as a barrister, who may or may not share exactly the views of the state or entity that I happen to be acting for, the issues that you are all reading about and that people across the world are now thinking about. And frankly, it's a real privilege to be involved in the world of international law on these matters. It gives me hope because in relation to all of these matters, it's the second anniversary today of the start of the latest phase of a long war between Russia and Ukraine. I'm not for or against Ukraine as such. I'm not for or against Russia as such. I'm not for or against Ukrainian people versus Russian people or Russian people against Ukrainian people. I'm for the idea that there exists a system of rules which allow us to determine what is right and what is wrong, and which ultimately, as Hirsch Lauterpacht said, and as I quote in East-West Street, protect those who are the ultimate subjects of international law, individual human beings. That's essentially what international law is about. Now, in relation to the current situation, I have to say something about what is going on right now in relation to Israel and Palestine, because it is so painful and it is so very difficult. Some of you will know that in a short weeks after the terrible events of the 7th of October that I personally found deeply traumatic, because they reminded me so closely of the kind of tales that Bella Lemkin told her young son, Raphael Lemkin, were going on in the parts of the world where they were living in the late 19th and early 20th century, the kinds of images and stories that emerged after the 7th of October. It was frankly very triggering for me at that moment. And I knew that I wanted to find a way in a purely personal capacity to respond. And so a group of us, in the end, 8 of us, British, Jewish, and lawyers, wrote a letter to set out what we thought was a sort of roadmap of what international law did and did not permit and require. It was a delicate exercise, and we really understood that. And we wanted to be respectful of a range of different views and perspectives on all sides, but we felt we needed to do something because we sensed where this might be going. And we took refuge in the rules of international law that emerged in 1945 and that were very largely crafted by people like Hirsch Lauterpacht, Raphael Lemkin, René Cassin, and so many others around the world. And in that letter, we essentially made 3 rather simple points. 1, what happened on the 7th of October was a crime, a terrible crime, and justice must be done in relation to that crime. 2, Israel, of course, has a right to live in security and is entitled to exercise self-defense under international law in order to protect itself from attacks of this kind. And 3, that right of self-defense is not unlimited. It must be exercised in accordance with international law, which means that the rules promoted by people like Herschel Lauterpacht and Raphael Lemkin must be respected at all times. Individuals have rights, and groups have rights. Interestingly, the publication of such a letter did not produce a sort of onslaught of opprobrium from either of the two sides on the extreme vantage point that one would have expected. I think to a certain extent we were protected because one of the signatories of that letter, and I want to salute his courage, was David Neuberger, who was a former president of the Supreme Court of this country. I should say it was pretty tough finding people to sign such a letter at the end of October, which itself says quite a lot. But the letter was plainly right. It has had an impact at the highest political levels in terms of defining the position taken by a number of countries, including the United Kingdom and the United States, at the very highest levels. And that is a decent thing. Now, the letter for me was particularly complex. I was very happy to sign it and very happy to participate in the writing of it, because at that very moment, and for a year, I had been involved as counsel for the state of Palestine in proceedings before the International Court of Justice on a request for an advisory opinion from the General Assembly of the United Nations, asking the court to determine the legality of, amongst other issues, Israel's occupation of the occupied Palestinian territories and the right of self-determination of the people of Palestine. So I knew this case was coming along. Of course, one could not have predicted what would have happened on the 7th of October. And as a good professional person, I continued with my engagement in that case. And the hearings, as some of you will be aware, have taken place this very week. And so last Monday, at the International Court of Justice in The Hague, I appeared with a number of other counsel for the state of Palestine to make the submissions of Palestine under international law in relation to its views on what the international rules required in relation to long-standing issues between Israel and Palestine, but of course involving many, many other countries. Now, in a certain sense, that could be seen as a very delicate situation for a Jewish guy from North London to be doing at this most difficult time. But when I really focused on it, coming back to what I said earlier, in standing before the International Court of Justice, what is someone like me really doing? It's one of the wonderful things of the English bar that I'm deeply proud of, is you're essentially making arguments for the idea that there is a rule of law in international relations. It's not pro or anti-Palestinian to be making a case for or against in those arguments. It's not pro or anti-Israeli to be making arguments for or against in those situations. It's not anti or pro-Islamic or anti or pro-Semitic to be doing that. What you're doing when you stand before the International Court of Justice is essentially saying there is such a thing as the rule of law, and the rule of law is applicable to all countries and to all people at all times. And that experience of standing before a panel of 15 judges, it's not like in the English courts where you get one judge or 3 judges or 5 judges or very occasionally 7 judges. You're standing there with 15 judges from different jurisdictions across the world, and you're scanning them. And there was, of course, a degree of interest from the judges in this case, precisely because they understood their very great responsibility at this particular moment. I know a lot of the judges, in fact almost all of the judges, very, very well. They are people of independence. They are people of impartiality. They are people who understand their responsibilities. And when they hand down decisions, they think incredibly carefully about their interpretation and application of the law and the consequences that it will have. And so I'm filled with grief when people, often on the far end of the spectrum of different parties, start to attack the judges individually, not quite enemies of the state language, but in some instances much worse. Or they attack the institution itself, or they attack the very idea of the rule of international law. And as they attack that very idea of the rule of international law as somehow being pro or anti a particular set of interests, I just go back to Tom Bergenthal. I just imagine Tom Bergenthal as a 10-year-old boy. It was extraordinary to be able to ask him, how did you deal with your situation as a 10-year-old boy? And for him to say, we learned how to deal with this man. We learned to avoid eye contact, and we learned to hope. And then he said, in my case, I put my hope for the rest of my life into the idea of constructing a system of rules which are imperfect, which are a work in progress, but which nevertheless offer something better than the alternative. And so, in this difficult time, as the settlement of 1945 comes under intense attack, I think it's incredibly important to bear in mind what is the alternative to a system of rules under international law. Is it better than what we have now? Does it make us safer or more secure than what we have now? Does it offer greater hope than what we have now? And I think those questions answer themselves. I'm immensely touched to be here with you and to share what is a difficult moment. And I thank you warmly for the invitation.